Hello, students. Today we're going to study a very, very cool substance. It is water. We're going to look at water and we are going to study it because it is one of the most important chemical compounds on Earth. Actually, it is the most important chemical compound for life. And it is unusual because it has so many magical properties. It exists in all three states on the surface of the Earth. It exists as a solid, as a liquid, and as a gas. This is very, very cool because most compounds exist in either one or the other form under normal temperature and pressure. But water is just a very unusual compound. It just has one oxygen atom and two hydrogen atoms, and they're connected by a covalent bond. And this is where the magic lies, in the unequal distribution of the electrons being shared in the covalent bond and giving it a temporary negative charge to one side of the molecule and temporary positive charges on the other sides. Water covers about 70% of the Earth's surface, and so Earth is basically covered almost all with water. 70% is water. And of all that water that we have, about 96.5% of the Earth's water is in the oceans. So we have very little left. We have 3.5% water left, which is not in the oceans. So where is all of that? Well, about 2.5% of the Earth's water is fresh water, which is what we need for life. However, most of it is locked up. It's locked up as either ice or groundwater. Only a tiny amount is present in rivers and lakes, and a very, very small fraction, a variable fraction, is present in the atmosphere. But yet, water is essential for life. In fact, when we go to other planets, what we really want to do is look for signs of water, because if we see water, then we will find life as we know it. And it is water's unique properties that have made the Earth habitable. It is because of these wonderful properties of this compound that the Earth is habitable. And let's look at those properties. So before we do that, we need to look at the hydrologic cycle. So we know that in a cycle you can start on any side, any corner, any part, any arrow, because it's a circle. So if we start with the corner which has the sun right here. Oops. I guess this isn't going to work today. That's all right. But here we are. That's the sun in that corner. The sun is going to be beating down a lot of heat onto the oceans. And the oceans are going to heat up, and then the water is going to evaporate from a liquid phase into a gas phase. It enters the atmosphere, and as it rises, it cools. And then at a certain point, it's going to start dropping down because cool air is heavy. So when it drops down, it will come down as rain, and we will have it fall on the earth, mountains. If it falls on a mountain, we get rivers, and all this water will either go down into the ground as groundwater. Some of it will flow it back into the rivers, into the ocean, and then the cycle starts all over again. So we all know that this is the hydrologic cycle, and we know that it is very, very, very essential that the water molecules keep cycling through a gaseous phase, a liquid phase, and sometimes even a solid phase. So the structure of the water molecule allows it to interact with other molecules. The electrons spend more time towards the oxygen part of the molecule, because the oxygen part of the molecule, the oxygen atom, is huge compared to the hydrogen atoms, which are very, very small. I mean, all they have is just the one tiny little proton and the one little electron. But the oxygen atom has neutrons and protons, and it's this massive giant. So there is sharing. It is a covalent bond, but it's unequal sharing. So the electron spends most of its time towards the oxygen side than equal sharing, where the nuclei of both atoms pull the electron in an equal fashion. Hydrogen's nucleus cannot do that. So it does share, but very little. And so it becomes a polar molecule. So at one side of the molecule, you have an electron spending most of its time. So that part of the molecule becomes negatively charged for some time. And then when it goes away, then everything is fine. But while that part of the molecule, the part which has the oxygen in, is negatively charged, then obviously the other part has to be positively charged, because the hydrogens will therefore be waiting for their electron, their share of its time, and it won't be there. So what we will see is this unequal sharing. But this is a great thing, because this polarity itself allows a whole bunch of features to emerge. And one of them is that hydrogen bonds are formed with each other. So if you look at this picture and you see the great big red ball is the great big oxygen atom. And the tiny little white balls are supposed to represent the very small hydrogen atoms. And when you see these partial negative charges sitting on top of the oxygen atom, that's because the molecule is negatively charged just where the oxygen is. So when one molecule of water is sitting in a liquid, it is going to start, because of the charge difference, it's going to start attracting other molecules, but not the same part. It will attract opposite charges. So the negative part of the water molecule will start attracting the positive parts of other water molecules around it. And so we'll have this very fragile bond that forms and breaks all the time, and it's called a hydrogen bond. So the polar covalent bonds would be these. Whoopsie. So these are the covalent bonds. This is where the sharing is going on. These are the hydrogen bonds. This is where there's no sharing. There's just an attraction, because here is a negative charge and here is a positive charge, and so there's an attraction, and that is what is known as the hydrogen bond. Whoops. So because water is a polar molecule, there are 4 very wonderful properties that water contributes towards life. One is its cohesive behavior. Another is water has the immense ability to be a heat sink. So sunlight can keep shining on the surface of water, and water will not boil right away. In fact, it takes 100 degrees before water will change phase from liquid to gas. So that is a huge ability of it to be an excellent solvent. And then this extremely unusual property where water expands on freezing instead of shrinking. Almost every compound shrinks when it freezes and becomes a solid, but not water. Water actually expands And this allows for a bunch of properties for life to, for it to be suitable for life, which we'll look at in a minute. And then its versatility as a solvent. Water is one of the most universal solvents there is. It manages to dissolve very, very many things, much more things than any other solvent. Okay, so if we look at each property separately, the cohesion, for instance, what is that, and how does that help life, or how does it even affect anything? Well, because the hydrogen bonds are present, those very weak interactions between the polar parts of each molecule, that tiny weak hydrogen bond will actually give water a property of cohesion. Cohesion is such a wonderful property. It will help transport against the force of gravity. Gravity is an enormous force, but this tiny little hydrogen bond, which has very little energy, lots of these tiny little bonds will actually be able to counteract the effect of gravity, and roots of plants are able to pull up water instead of not being able to pull up any water and not being able to live. Roots are able to pull the water up and send it against the force of gravity to their leaves and their shoots and branches. So that is an outstanding quality of water molecules. Adhesion is an attraction between different substances, so that's not the same as cohesion. We do have adhesion between water molecules and plant cell walls, and that's also a great thing because that helps the water actually rise against the force of gravity. As you can see in this image, the water is being pulled up from the roots all the way up the tree trunk to the very tip of the tree, and that is because of two very wonderful properties of water: cohesion and adhesion. So it sticks to the sides of the cells and it sticks to itself, and that's how water is actually transpired. Surface tension is another outstanding property of water. Water has a very unusually high surface tension, and again, it's because of those beautiful little hydrogen bonds. Other molecules, other compounds do not have such surface tension. Water has this ability that even the very small insects sometimes can even run on water because the surface tension is so immense. And then water has a heat sink. So water can absorb an awful lot of heat, an awful lot of energy without its temperature changing. So what happens is, because the earth is covered, 70% of the earth is covered with water, this ocean will actually absorb any irregularities in the temperature, and it keeps the temperature of the globe constant. It doesn't make it weird or bad for life. It's this nice big blanket that traps all the irregularities, and the rest of the world will then just continue because there's 100 degrees between 0 and 100 when water is either a solid or a gas. And in those 100 degrees, it stays a liquid. It keeps on absorbing heat, but it stays a liquid. So that is a very important property, because some animals are cold-blooded, some animals are warm-blooded, some life exists on the poles. It's very cold there, and some life exists on deserts, and it's really hot there. And no life form actually boils, because the water that's inside them is also a heat sink. So this is an excellent property for life. We do need to talk a little bit about energy. So kinetic energy, if you recall, is the energy of motion. It is associated with a random motion of atoms. We usually call it thermal energy or temperature. So when we take the temperature, what we're really doing is we're measuring the average kinetic energy of molecules in that body of matter. And when we talk about thermal energy, we can transfer it from one body of matter to another. And when we do that, that's called heat. So these are some terms that are helpful in understanding some of the concepts that are about to come. Other terms, we do need to know how to measure heat. So a calorie is the amount of heat required to raise the temperature of 1 gram of water by 1 degrees Celsius. The calories that you see on a food package label, those aren't really calories. I know they're spelled with a small c, but they're really kilocalories. And a kilo means 1,000. Sometimes we don't use calorie. Most of the times we'll use joules. Joule is another unit of energy. 1 joule is actually a fraction of a calorie. It's only 0.239 calories. So it's a very small unit. Or in other words, 1 calorie is actually equal to a little bit over 4 joules. So the high specific heat of water, it's very high. It's 1. And what does that mean? That means it resists changing its temperature. You can keep on dumping in more energy, but the temperature of the water won't rise as fast as it would for another substance. So that is known as specific heat. Specific heat of a substance is the amount of the amount of heat that has to be either absorbed or lost for 1 gram. 1 gram of that substance to change the temperature by 1 degrees Celsius. Okay, so that is where water differs from every other compound, because the amount of heat that is needed to change the temperature by 1 degree Celsius for 1 gram of water is a lot. Okay? And you might say, well, how much? How much is that? Let's see if I can actually get this thing to not give me any more difficulties. Whoops. The specific heat, the reason for that is, again, it's beautiful hydrogen bonds. Those tiny little weak bonds are the reason for the immense amount of specific heat that water has. Heat is absorbed when the hydrogen bonds break, and heat is released when the hydrogen bonds form. So that is why the oceans are able to minimize any temperature fluctuations. Life is it's sort of like a nice buffer, and it allows life to continue when nothing else is. Everything else is the same. The next property of water that is kind of cool to think about is what happens when it evaporates. So evaporation is the transformation of the phase. It changes from a liquid to a gas. And every time that happens, we can measure it. We can measure that energy change or heat change. We call it the heat of vaporization. That is the amount of heat the liquid must absorb for 1 gram of it to be converted to gas. So as a liquid evaporates, what happens is the rest of the liquid, the surface of it, cools down because the heat is taken away from that liquid and it is sent up into the gas, and that process is called evaporative cooling. So the cooling of water is what helps stabilize temperatures in organisms. So when we sweat, for instance, that is exactly what is happening. The heat of vaporization is being utilized The property of evaporative cooling is what gives you the cooling effect, because the water droplet of the sweat droplet that's on your skin will actually absorb the heat and then evaporate away, so it's gone and you get a cooling effect. Here is a very pretty picture of evaporative cooling. So you see that it's probably something like a hot spring, like Yellowstone Park maybe, and the water is very, very hot, and as the steam is rising, the rest of the water, the rest of the body of water gets a cooling effect of that. The other property of water, which is just so amazing, is how it expands when it becomes a solid, instead of shrinking. So because of that reason, ice can actually float in liquid water, and water's biggest density is actually at 4 degrees centigrade. Let's think about it. So if all the ice sank, what would happen to the lakes and the rivers and the ponds and any body of water that was around? Maybe not perhaps an ocean, but smaller bodies of water. The ice would sink to the bottom, and all the life forms that were sitting at the bottom would be pushed up and up and up and up until finally the entire lake would be frozen solid and every life form in there would freeze. Well, that's not what happens in real life. What we get is the surface of a pond or a lake will freeze, but the bottom will not. It will never freeze. So you get a thick layer of ice or a thin layer of ice or any sort of layer of ice on the top, but underneath that layer of ice is still water. Okay, the water is at 0, at 4, and in between, and the ice that's sitting on top of the water is at 0, and the water that is touching that ice is at 0. But underneath that, there's a gradient, and the water is at the bottom of the pond is 4. So 4 degrees centigrade, and life can exist very happily in there. Maybe it won't be a huge pond for them to swim around in, but there's still plenty of water for them to exist until the season changes and the ice thaws and they have the entire pond again. So that is an outstanding way of life being helped along by water. Here's a picture of an iceberg, and you know that 9/10 of the iceberg is always submerged. What you see on the top is only 1/10. And here are those hydrogen bonds that make this all happen. They're very stable, they're very weak, but they're very, very stable. And in the middle picture, you actually see a life form, some sort of shrimp, that is just some sort of animal. And he is living underneath the ice, so he can feed and forage, and he doesn't have to freeze to death. And liquid water at the right-hand side at the bottom of the slide shows you that the bonds are always forming and reforming. They break and they form again. They break and they form again. These hydrogen bonds are dynamic, and that's because it's a property of a liquid. So a few more definitions. A solution is a liquid that is a complete homogeneous mixture of substances. So anything you mix inside is just completely distributed evenly all over. So that would be called a solution. There are two things to a solution. There's a solvent and a solute. A solvent would be the bigger part of the solution, which actually holds the solute in. And the solute is the substance that you're dissolving. We usually have aqueous solutions for life, and we call it aqueous because water is the solvent, and its versatility is due to its polarity. So when you think about it, you have this one water molecule, and it has these polar edges, Well, when you put something ionic inside water, like for instance sodium chloride, just plain old table salt, what will happen is, since sodium chloride has an ionic bond, the sodium ion will be positively charged. The chloride ion is negatively charged. And each ion will therefore be immediately surrounded by a sphere or a shell of water molecules pointing their opposite charges to that ion. So if it's a sodium ion and has a positive charge, then all the negative parts of the water molecule, which are the oxygen parts, they will be pointing towards that sodium ion, and the hydrogen parts will be pointing away. And so you have this ball of water surrounding an embedded ion of sodium. And the opposite will happen to chloride. So the chloride ion will be embedded also in a ball of water, if you will, with all the hydrogen parts of the water molecules pointing towards the chloride ion. And those balls are called hydration shells. And they look sort of like this. So this is what I was just explaining. So water can also dissolve compounds that are not ionic. It doesn't have to be ionic to be able to be dissolved in water. Even polar molecules like proteins can dissolve in water if they have just regions that are ionic and polar. They can be carried along in solvents like blood, which is mostly water, and they'll be happy to do that. For instance, in this picture, here is the purple part is supposed to be a protein, and it has some areas which are ionic or charged. And as you can see, the little red balls with the two white, what look like ears, those ears are really the hydrogen part of the water molecule. Those are actually touching that protein. If the negative part of the protein is being touched by the positive part of the water molecule, which is the hydrogen atoms, and the positive part of the protein is being touched by the great big red part of the water molecule, which is the oxygen. So that is very cool, because it's just surrounded in this big ball of water, inside water, and it's carried around. And this brings us to two other terms, hydrophilic and hydrophobic substances. So something that is hydrophilic, philic means loving, and phobic means hating. So hydrophilic means loving water. So any substance that has an affinity for water is called hydrophilic, and if it doesn't, it's called hydrophobic. For instance, oils are hydrophobic because they cannot mix in water. They don't have polar bonds, and they just can't dissolve in water. But hydrophobic molecules, you might say, well, that's not good. But it is. It is. We do need both types of molecules. We do need hydrophilic and we need hydrophobic. If we didn't have hydrophobic molecules, how would we make a cell membrane and keep the inside of the cell inside and the outside environment outside? We need a membrane, and here hydrophobicity is a good thing. Most chemical reactions in organisms involve solutes that are dissolved in water, but before we can actually do any of these experiments, we need to do some math. And what we do is we use mass to calculate the number of solute molecules in some solution. And we call it molecular mass, which is the sum of all masses of all atoms in a molecule. The number of molecules are usually measured in moles. 1 mole is equal to 6.02 times 10 to the 23 molecules. And you might recognize that number, that very distinct number, as Avogadro's number. And you're right. So Avogadro's number is actually, it's unitless. It's just like saying a dozen. When you say a dozen, you already know that you're meaning 12. 12 of something. It could be 12 spoons. It could be 12 people. It could be 12 cheetahs. It could be something, anything. But dozen means 12. And similarly, Avogadro's number also means 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd somethings. So it could be shoes, fishes, molecules, people. It could be anything. But when we use the unit Dalton, which we use when we're talking about atoms, we say that Avogadro's number in Daltons is equal to 1 gram of that chemical. So molarity and then is the number of moles of solute per liter of solution, because we already defined the mole. So when we want that number of many moles of solute in 1 liter of solution, we define the molarity of that solution. We have been looking for life on other planets because we are always wondering, are we alone in this universe? And it stands to reason we couldn't be. It doesn't make any sense. So we're always looking for signals of life on other planets. We may not be able to get there, but it is just nice to know that there are life forms elsewhere. But when we do that, we can't actually go there. But what we do is we look for signals, and we look for water. We look for water on other planets because we know that all life forms, life as we know it, does require water. Even the most extreme forms of life require water at some point in their cycle. So life as we don't know it, well, we wouldn't know what they require or not because we don't know that kind of life. So we only look for life as we know it. And as we know it, all life does require water at some point. So on other planets, so far we've found about 1,800 other planets, not in our solar system, but other stellar systems have planets that are sort of similar to Earth. Maybe they're super Earths, they're really big. Maybe they're the size of Jupiter, really, really big. But we have found other planets and that seem like they could be candidates or possibilities for life. But we check their atmospheres to see if they have water or not. In our own solar system, we have Mars, and on Mars we have all these very beautiful pictures which show that there used to be water on Mars. If you look on the top picture on the top left-hand corner, what you see are these very fine lines. Let me see if I can actually draw one. Yeah, I can follow it. So that is a river, and all these little rivers are joining up and becoming one mighty river, which is opening up into, if you see this, it's like a delta, and this is a beach. So these are all rivers that used to be on Mars, but now are unfortunately, they're all dried up. And all we are left with are traces or gouges of what seems to have been a lot of water flowing on Mars. And if you look at the picture on the right-hand side, you can actually see this undulating pattern of liquid moving on the regolith, or the surface of Mars. And at the very bottom, you can see this beautiful picture where you actually see tracks of rocks being tumbled along and by the water on what seems like ancient riverbeds, dried up riverbeds on the surface of Mars. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to look at other properties of solutions and water, solvents, and just their properties, like what actually are we measuring when we look at them besides the molarity. What are we looking at? We're looking at the hydrogen positive ions. So if a solution has more hydrogen ions, then it has other properties than a solution that has less of them. So we've noticed that the solutions that have a lot of hydrogen ions are really acidic. So these hydrogen bonds can actually shift from one to another and inside liquid water, and the hydrogen atom can leave its electron behind. And at that point, that free-floating electron is gone, but the hydrogen atom itself is now positively charged. And the molecule that lost the proton is now a hydroxide ion. So the molecule with the extra proton is now a hydronium ion, because that electron will actually just be left behind, and the atom is transferred as a proton. Okay, so here we have, instead of writing H3O positive, which looks kind of funny, we just cancel the water out of it, and we just represent it as a positive H. Okay, so here we are. This is a depiction of what I just said. So here we have two little water molecules, and they have a nice little hydrogen bond in between them. When, oops, all of a sudden, one of the hydrogen atoms just loses itself onto another water molecule, and so that water molecule now has an excess of hydrogen ions. So it has one extra proton. So this becomes positively charged, whereas the other one that lost it is now negatively charged. So this happens all the time because water is in a state of dynamic equilibrium. The molecules dissociate at the same rate that they are formed again. So this is a continuous process. But while it is happening, you have an excess of a hydrogen ion on one side and a loss on another. So this is a really interesting property because it leads to acids and bases. And we can actually measure this, and we call it the pH scale. So changes in concentration of the positive hydrogen ion, the negative OH ion, can actually drastically affect the chemistry of a cell. And we really don't want to do that. We don't want to mess with that. So in water, the concentrations of the positive and the negative ions are equal. But if we start adding other solutes, like acids or bases, we will modify this concentration. And so we can actually describe if a solution is acidic or basic. So an acid is any substance that increases the hydrogen ion concentration of the solution. And a base is any substance that reduces the hydrogen concentration of a solution. Strong acids and bases actually dissociate completely in water, but weak acids, where the real interesting stuff happens, are the ones that reversibly release and accept the hydrogen ions back and send them away, but they can still shift the balance, the pH balance, away from neutrality. So here is a picture showing a basic solution. So this would be where the hydrogen ions are less and the OH ions are more. And in the neutral solution, which is the beaker in the center, what you see is they're equally distributed. Whereas in the acidic solution, which is the beaker on the very right-hand side, you see more hydrogen ions than OH ions. Okay, and so the pH scale is actually is defined at 25 degrees centigrade, and it's a product of the hydrogen ion concentration and the OH ion concentration, and so it can be written as, if you multiply the two, it's 10 to the negative 14. The pH of a solution is defined by the negative log of the hydrogen ion concentration, and it is written as pH of H as negative log concentration of hydrogen ions. And so for a neutral aqueous solution, the hydrogen ion concentration is therefore 10 raised to the negative 7. How do we get that pH? We go like this. The pH becomes 7 minus minus 7 becomes just simply 7. And in this slide, what we see is a depiction of the pH scale. The pink part is acidic, where it shows that there are more hydrogen ions than there are OH ions. And the blue part, which is towards 14, shows that there are less hydrogen ions than there are OH ions. And we have another picture which will actually show what are those things that are acidic. So you see battery acid, lemon juice, and so on. These are all acidic. Ammonia, bleach, oven cleaner, those are all basic. So it's kind of interesting to notice that human tears are pH 7. Blood is a little bit more than that, but you know, that's fine. Seawater is pH 8, and also the small intestine, the interior of that is also pH 8. And we have finally, we're going to end with buffers. So buffers, so acidic solutions will have pH values less than 7. Basic solutions have pH values greater than 7. But the inside of most cells have to remain close to 7 because most enzymes can't act at very low or very high pHs. So we generally have buffers or substances that minimize these changes in concentration of the positive and negative ions in the solution, and so they help keep the cells regulated and working just fine.